Good afternoon, sensational second graders. Today we're going to go ahead and do chapter 3 of our book, The Case of the Dognapped Cat, Catnapped. Catnapped. All right, go ahead and get your books out. Open them up to page 19, and let's read. Inside the van, Samson opened his eyes. He lay still, trying to get his bearings. Then he flexed his muscles and struggled to get up. Folds of rough cloth snared his paws and sent him crashing back down. He fell against something hard. The smell of raw gas sickened him, and he gagged miserably. "What's that?" a man's thin voice asked. A deep, gruff voice answered, "Jumpy tonight, aren't you?" The other voice exclaimed, "Lay off, Mick. You almost got us caught this morning going back for that stupid poodle." "Well, how was I supposed to know that poodle belonged to the police chief's wife?" Mick snarled. "If you'd been doing your research, that wouldn't have happened, would it?" "I don't see why I'm the one to show myself in town," the thin voice went higher. "I take all the risks. I'm the one who talks to the customers. My face is the one they'll remember." Mick's voice sounded more reasonable now. "But who will remember, Albert? You're the one who's got the knack of blending in with the background, right? And those big eyes of yours, they can melt the most suspicious heart in any town. Just remember that old battle axe in Tallahassee. She thinks you only meant to use her Scotty in a commercial. Last I heard, she had her nephew arrested for kidnapping the dog. You have a real gift." "You're right," Albert said. "We couldn't make it without me. How about that lawn mowing service I thought up? We check the houses for dogs while we're mowing, and the owners never suspect." Mick sighed loudly. "Sure, Albert, sure." Inside the sack, Samson made one more try to get up. He failed and sank back weakly. He lay still, waiting. The van floor vibrated gently under him. The sack slid a few inches backward and forward as the van stopped at traffic lights and accelerated again. It bounced slightly as the van rattled over the railroad tracks and turned. For a long time, there was nothing except the smooth vibration of the engine. Samson drifted off to sleep once more. He awoke as the van turned, slowed, turned again, and bumped roughly along a side road. Finally, it stopped, and Samson drowsily tried to shift his body. Someone opened the door to the van. Samson caught a whiff of salty air, but before he could pull himself up, the door slammed shut and the van crawled forward. "Get out and shut it," Mick growled. "Look," Albert said, "I'm tired of climbing in and out to open and shut the dumb gate. What difference does it make anyway?" "It's not going to keep those dogs in, and who else would bother? Nobody's been here for ages." "A deserted house attracts all kinds of visitors," Mick replied. "Especially a deserted house with electricity." He snorted. "Imagine Eldridge expecting us to camp out in the boondocks with gasoline lanterns and a propane stove. Anyway, I want us to be the only guests at this country inn, and I'm as tired as you are." His voice rose suddenly. "Got it?" Albert answered quickly. "All right, Mick," he said. "All right." The door opened again. When it slammed shut, the van accelerated and bounced up a short road. It stopped under a dense growth of pines. Frantic barking filled the air. Samson stiffened in alarm. Before he could react, the door opened. Someone picked up the sack, jerking him upward. He fell back into the folds of cloth. His body hung heavily in space, and all he could do was spit. The men clumped up something wooden. Steps? A door groaned. The sack swung as he was carried across a creaking floor. Samson's head buzzed. He moved in the sack. "Where'll I put this one?" Albert asked over the noise of barking dogs. Mick raised his voice. "Dump him in the room with the others." "You're crazy if you think I'm going to open that door right now," Albert shouted back. "Those dogs would tear me apart." "That room down the hall," Mick said. "Put him in there. Just leave him in the sack. We'll take care of him in the morning." "Suits me," Albert muttered. The sack swung some more as he walked down the hall. A minute later, he dropped it on the floor. Inside, Samson lay motionless, half stunned by the fall. Someone pounded on the wall. "Shut up! Shut up, dogs!" The barking reached a fever pitch, then began to dwindle. Finally, only loud woofling and an occasional bark could be heard. Late that night, Samson began to gnaw at a rip in the seam of the sack. Every once in a while, he had to stop for a rest, but he forced himself to keep working. Finally, he chewed a hole in the rough cloth that was large enough to squeeze through. He crouched on the floor. Dawn lit the room in a thin gray light. Samson yawned and stretched as he looked around. Then he yawned again. He was alone here, but he could smell others in the house. Men and dogs. Cautiously, he began to circle the room, staying close to the baseboards, detouring around the piles of old furniture. The one window in the room was closed and boarded up from the outside. Samson leaped for the windowsill and fell back weakly. He tried again. This time, he made it. He rubbed against the pane. Early morning light poured around the broken boards. Through a crack, he could see a tangle of palmettos and high grass that would offer him concealment if only he could reach it. He pawed at the pane. It didn't give. He turned and eyed the open door. With one leap, he was back on the floor, but something was moving in the other room. Bed springs creaked. Samson headed for a stack of chairs that leaned against one wall. Slowly, feeling more and more dizzy, he climbed to its height. At the top, he crept into the bottom of a broken chair and surveyed the room uneasily. Empty dog food bags lay crumpled just inside the door, and a few cardboard boxes were stacked against the opposite wall. Samson waited, his gaze fixed on the open door. A faint scratching sound drew his attention to the ceiling. A small gray mouse was climbing into a jagged hole in the plaster. Samson's stomach rumbled. He tensed, and the chair wobbled. In one desperate motion, he launched himself, his head and shoulders entering the opening, and he clawed the rest of the way through. After he had breakfasted, Samson yawned. All he wanted to do was sleep, but first he had to explore his new territory. It lay above the rooms, covered by a sagging roof. Perhaps there was a hole in the roof that was big enough to squeeze through. No, there was no way out except down. He tiptoed along the rafters, inspecting the fallen sections of ceiling. One rafter led into the room from which he had escaped. Another lay directly over the room behind it. Samson stopped on the rafter above this room and looked down. Most of the ceiling was gone, giving him a clear view. Dogs lay sprawled on the floor, sleeping. Samson's nose twitched, and he snarled softly. Below him, one of the dogs woke and sniffed. It looked up. Suddenly, a deafening roar of frantic barking from all the dogs drowned out every sound in the house. Samson crouched on the rafter, ears flattened. The dogs ran in circles, throwing themselves against the wall in an effort to reach him. After a few minutes, Samson relaxed and draped himself across the rafter. He watched drowsily as a brown-spotted dog jumped again and again. After each effort, the dog fell back, panting heavily. Samson yawned. If the noise would stop, he could get some sleep. Exasperated yells began to come from the front room. Samson remained where he was until footsteps stamped down the hall. Then he shrank back into the shadows to listen and watch. "Knock it off," Mick yelled, banging on the door. When the dogs quieted, Mick stalked away, calling for Albert to bring the dog food. He stopped at the next doorway. There was a moment of silence as the man stared into the room where Albert had left the sack last night. "Hey, Albert," he called. "You put that pug in with the others?" "No, I dumped him in the other room," Albert called. "You told me to." "Then where is he?" "In the sack. Where else?" Samson found a convenient rafter and settled down. Below him, a tall man appeared in the doorway, looking sleepy. He scratched his t-shirt and stared blankly at the empty sack in Mick's hand. "How'd he get out?" he asked in his thin voice. "You should have dumped him in with the others," Mick said. "Now get cracking and find that pug." Samson flattened himself against the rafter as Albert looked up. "You don't suppose he went up there, do you?" Mick snorted in disgust. "A dog? What do you think he is? Half cat?" The men made a great deal of commotion with the piles of furniture, but Samson was too sleepy to watch. Finally, they went away. Samson closed his eyes. That's chapter 3. Stay tuned for chapter 4. Bye, second graders.